Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this week's Gript live stream. I hope I find you well this Wednesday evening. I see people already tuning in, which is good as ever. Yeah, I hope everyone's well this Wednesday evening, that the torrential downpour isn't getting everyone down. Um, yeah, good to have you all back with us this Wednesday evening. As ever, we invite your comments through YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. I'm not sure if we're being shown on Instagram. We're once again without our producer this week, so the tech side of things falls to me, which means there's a higher chance they're going to be a disaster. But last week went well enough, and we're rolling again this week, so I'll take that as being a success. This week, what we want to discuss, I suppose, the most controversial story of the week that isn't related to Trump or Greenland or anything like that, is the Irish Council for Civil Liberties Trans Rights Guide, for want of a better way of naming it, because the actual name is kind of lengthy. Because while it was published in December, it sort of exploded into controversy last week after the Irish Times published an article about it, which, despite the fact that the guide is really long, first of all, they homed in on the aspect related to schools, in which the guidance issued was essentially that schools must use students' preferred pronouns and names in schools, which this issue never fails to be controversial to, obviously, or to ignite pushback, and it was no less the case this time. Thankfully, good good to see people haven't lost their teeth. So that's what we're going to discuss this week. So obviously very keen to see what people have to say about that. So if you send in comments across the different platforms, I will get them on the back end here, and whichever ones we can host, we'll be happy to do so. So I suppose where to begin? I suppose to begin with the guide itself. Why not? So this was published last, and the only reason I'm not sharing my screen this week or next week is because it's kind of difficult to navigate all of the things I need to navigate when I'm doing everything by myself. And when my producer here is here, it's a lot easier. So you're going to have a nice audio treat, I suppose, this week as I just read through everything. So to begin with the guide itself, it's called Know Your Rights, a guide for trans and non-binary people. This is produced by organizations you may or may not be aware of. I'm not sure if you're politically engaged. I'm not sure how you couldn't be aware of them, given that they seem to be everywhere all the time doing everything. There was three organizations primarily involved, and one in a supporting role. So there's the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. There was the Transgender Equality Network Ireland, or TENI as it's more well known, and then there's the LGBT charity Shout Out, which mainly does youth work. Um, but there was another key player in here, which is the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, which is a statutory body in Ireland, if I remember correctly. It's sort of supposed to be be the state's independent human rights watchdog. Um, Straight off the bat, there's stuff you can take issue with there. I wrote an article about the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission last November, in which I was essentially saying that that organization in many ways strains the word independent, strains the meaning of the word independent. The best example of this is that last November, what occasioned that article was that the government had recommended 6 new commission members to the commission. As I say, this is constantly independent national human rights institution. Most EU states have one. As I say, I don't know where the word independent comes in here, because the 6 people who were proposed, in nearly all of them in some shape or form, had worked for an organization that had received extensive state report, either directly through money or sort of just platforming, or they'd sort of done work for the state in some sort of tangential capacity before. So it's an extraordinarily influential organization on sort of Ireland's human rights scene. But I think this is worth lingering on, because I just feel like this is so farcical. The 6 commissioners that the government recommended to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission last November were Sam Blackensy, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, who's the equality officer at Maynooth University, who had previously worked for TENI, who produced this guide, and who uses they, them pronouns. You had Catherine Costello, who's a professor of global refugee and migration law at University College Dublin, who has previous board member experience, including as a member of the board of the Irish Refugee Council, which is another organization you seem to see everywhere. You had, and this one obviously kind of takes the biscuit, the Taoiseach's brother, Adam Harris, who was being reappointed. He'd already done work with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. He's the founder and CEO of autism charity As I Am, and he sat on the board of directors of one of Ireland's most powerful NGOs. We wrote an article about that previously, Rethink Ireland. So a finger in every a lot of these people have sort of a finger in every NGO pie. You had Rosaleen McDonough, who's a what was she on? She's on the board of the Arts Council, again another state-related organization. The last two were also very interesting. You had Patricia Munatsi Mangwiza, who is a human rights lawyer who's also a member of the government's expert advisory committee on racial equality and racism. So she had input into the National Action Plan Against Racism, which, in my opinion, obviously commenting here as a person, is an absolutely disastrous document, essentially. And she also advises the special rapporteur, who Gript readers may remember, may be familiar with, Dr. Ebon Joseph. So, the last one, sorry, I was leaving the last one out, is Rose Wall, solicitor and consultant who sort of brought experience from across the NGO sector. So most of these people, as I say, all six of those people were proposed as the new commission members for the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, which so independence is a key part of IREC's composition. On their own about section on the website, it says, "We work independently of the government to protect and promote human rights and equality in Ireland." And I'll quote from their website here. "It is our job to protect and promote human rights and equality in Ireland, support a culture that respects human rights, equality, and understanding between different cultures in the country, raise awareness about the importance of human rights and equality, encourage good behavior and relationships between cultures, promoting tolerance and acceptance of differences, respecting everyone's freedom and dignity, help stop human rights violations, discrimination, and other unacceptable actions." So, as I said, many of the organizations those people worked for that I was mentioned are either had been involved with, had received varying amounts of state funding or administer state funding in the case of Rethink NGO, sort of direct money from the state, or they'd been involved in carrying out works done by the government, including, as I say, controversial works like that National Action Plan Against Racism. And so, through their various roles, spent the better part of the past decade working hand in glove with the government to advance their specific agendas of all of these different things. This is all just to say, because obviously the focus here, I'm getting derailed here, but the focus here isn't on the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, but it's just once again to sort of point out that the idea that these things are sort of independent grassroots productions from NGOs that have nothing to do with the state is just laughable, because in Ireland these things are also sort of tightly wound and the same people keep appearing in all of the same organizations. I mean, another prime example of that is the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, who I think he moved into the position of CEO of that organization. Joe O'Brien is just previously a government minister, so that was obviously an even more screaming 20 in which foreign funding made up less than 80% of the group's total funding. And I just think it's very interesting as to who those groups are that were providing so much money for the ICCL, which again was the sort of main actor behind this guide. The three largest sources of funding over that period were the Illuminate Group, which is set up by the French-American billionaire, oh no, a name I'm going to butcher here, Pierre Omidyar. The Open Society Foundation, you may or may not have heard of, obviously set up by Hungarian-American billionaire George Soros. The Sigrid Rousing Trust, set up by Sigrid Rousing of the Swedish Rousing family. Other major donors during that period included the Rowan Trust, which is a British organization, the Minderoo Foundation, set up by an Australian billionaire, I understand, the International Network for Civil Liberties organization, which is based in Switzerland. Indeed, going even further back, the American billionaire Chuck Feeney's Atlantic Philanthropies was instrumental in growing the ICCL from a small group into a major player in Ireland's sort of civil human rights affairs. So the idea that it's a kind of organic production. I keep going back to that because it's always the way you kind of get. They kind of promote this idea nearly that these things are being sort of demanded by the people, and that's very much not the case. It's coming from NGOs that, as is pointed out, very much very close to the government, supported by the government, receive funding from the government, receive funding from abroad. This is the point that really annoys me. Again, to go on another slight tangent, you will constantly get pushback. And Ben and I were only speaking about this on our podcast recently. You will constantly get pushback whenever anyone, say, pushes back on the gender ideology movement, whenever anyone expresses sort of resistance to the expansion of abortion in Ireland. You'll constantly hear the line that it's the importation of the American culture wars, as though all of the positions that these people are annoyed about are sort of native to Ireland in the first place. I mean, as though the idea that the language even that trans activists use, trans rights, non-binary, as though these are all native to the Irish soil, and that to, resist them is to resist Irishness itself. It's obviously farcical. And so many of these movements, I mean, the repeal movement, all of this, they so molded by the sort of similar American movements. It's very funny and hypocritical indeed that they keep using that line about importing the American culture wars whenever there's any sort of resist. What they ultimately mean is they want people making a fuss to go away. But anyway, to get back on track, because these have been major tangents, which I hope nevertheless were interesting. This guide that was produced by these organizations, I'll read it, I'll put it into their own words better than anything I can say. This guide tells you about your rights in Ireland as a trans person and non-binary person. It can also be useful for professionals, families, community representative organizations, and that most helpful organization, or that most helpful category is allies. One thing that's really funny about this guide, and it's pointed out in one of the articles we're going to be having a look at this evening, is they have the disclaimer at the bottom of every page, despite the fact that this is a trans rights, know your rights guide for trans and non-binary people. They have the disclaimer at the bottom of every page of the guide. Important. This guide is for your information only. It is not intended to be a substitute for legal advice. Despite the fact that the guide in its 148 pages is nearly continuously straying into sort of interpretations of human rights law and things like that. We have a lot of people coming through already. We have end of the line Joel. Thank you for joining us. For millennia, we knew instinctively that biological women were women, biological men were men. I mean, that's obviously true. I mean, there are people obviously throughout history, different sects and things like that have sort of adopted what I suppose in modern parlance you'd refer to as trans ideology or sort of gender Gnosticism. But nevertheless, those things were always very minute. And I am of the opinion, I might be wrong about this, that sort of full on assault on our understanding of these things is a very modern phenomenon. It's a very recent thing. It is funny. I keep previous live streams, I keep picking fights with with our listeners, which is never a good strategy. But it makes for good conversation, hopefully, which is that you're doing something very common there. I'm going to just go by Joel because it's the end of your name, which is that says you're using the qualifier biological women. I don't even think we should be doing that. I think that using the phrase biological women sort of implies as though there could be another kind of woman, which I think sort of plays into the gender ideology framework. This idea that, okay, you might not be a biological woman, but the real me, say, is a woman, and that therefore that takes precedence, and that's why I need you to acknowledge that I am a woman. That's why, and this is an area in which there's a lot of debate on I was going to say on the right, but I think there's a lot of people who take issue with this who certainly wouldn't even describe themselves as being on the right, like J.K. Rowling, or even indeed a lot of actors in Ireland. So, I don't know, it's a bit more boring, but I'm always just inclined to say we instinctively knew that women were women and men were men. I appreciate that it gets all very confusing though once you have people coming along on the internet in particular where you can't see what they are and they're saying that they're women or they're men when they obviously aren't, not when they're obviously not. Uh, excuse me. And just another comment from Joel. We've reached a point where sinister authorities demand compelled speech. You must deny reality to keep your livelihood. I mean, that's obviously sort of see an increasing number across the world of cases that take on that character. That was indeed why Jordan Peterson, if I remember correctly, sort of shot to prominence all those years ago, back in 2016, 10 years ago, my word. He was taking issue with sort of compelled speech laws in Canada that could have related to pronouns and things of that nature. And his great fame came from having a stand against that, which he was obviously right to do. We have Brendan Carraher coming in. It's a downright disgrace. There's only two genders, male and female. Anyone who thinks different obviously has a serious mental illness. I'm going to disagree with that. I think obviously some people are potentially mentally ill who suffer with this, but I think a lot of people are just genuinely confused. I think particularly about young people who grow up going to schools where this is just this framework, this worldview is just accepted. And I think it's very important that we sort of try to argue that with compassion, because it's the only way you're ultimately going this evening. And apologies, I'm scrolling through the comments myself, so it might be a little less smooth than usual. There's someone agreeing, I suppose, with my point. Woman says it all. Thanks. Adult, female, human. This is why I suppose I know a lot of people sort of roll their eyes at Matt Walsh, certainly in Irish circles, but it's why I think the "what is a woman" thing was so powerful. And if I remember correctly, I think Ben obviously asked this at a press conference to government ministers, but the whole point of that question was that it is so basic, and the fact that people are unable to answer it in our present age shows how far this movement, this ideology has gone. There was an absolutely astonishing clip. We'll get back on track with the guide now in a second, but there was an absolutely astonishing clip came out of I think it was an American Senate hearing. I might be wrong about what level it took place at exactly, where I think Senator Josh Hawley was asking an abortionist, a female doctor who carries out abortions, whether a man could get pregnant, and she just refused to answer the question. It was a really, I mean, I know we're years and years into this at this stage, but it was a really astonishing clip, because you've got obviously someone who's a doctor here. They had to qualify to become so. And he was asking her a yes or no question, and he was saying it's a yes or no question. Can a man get pregnant? And she just kept, it was almost like that the spinning circle of doom that you get on your computer was playing in her head. She would pause, and then she'd say, you're kind of trying to put it into a political framing. People have gotten themselves into a terrible shape over this, and it's why, as I say, these basic questions like what is a woman or can a man get pregnant are so powerful in refuting it, because I do have a great trust in people's basic, I suppose, sort of common sense. This is why this issue has become a sort of breaking point in the US, despite the sort of advanced state of liberalism in that country, and why indeed it seems to have the potential to become a breaking point in every country that it's currently afflicting, because it's just asking people to accept essentially the 2 + 2 + 2 = 5. So anyway, back to this guide. Yeah, it's essentially, so they speak about how this guide is produced in order to essentially let people know, trans and non-binary people, about their rights, so to use their terminology moment. It's too long to go through the whole thing. As I say, it's 148 pages long, so I think the more interesting way to approach it is to go through sort of the reaction to it initially, go through some of the sort of legal issues with it as a production, and then we'll go into as well actually what the department had to say about it, the Department of Education, because I obviously asked them, because bizarrely, they have a big section, as I said, this is what the Irish Times chose to report on. They have a big section as on how there's these sort of rights translate into the school setting. These rights, I suppose, to put it that way, translate into the school setting, and no one had thought to put that to the Department of Education, or if they hadn't sort of published or made a big deal of that. But anyway, with the reaction we had, obviously, again, many of our listeners may be familiar with her, psychotherapist Stella O'Malley, who does stellar work in this area. No pun intended. Stella doing stellar work. She said that the guide will harm kids, and that children first is the core child protection policy guiding Irish schools, adding that the Department of Education and TUSLA also offer policies in this context. And this is what we'll be getting into, obviously, that sort of trans activists always seem to operate in a world where there are no competing rights. There are no competing legal frameworks, even though that's reality. That's the way the world works. That's what comes up in courts. They try to act as though the only human reality that mattered was agency, or the ability to sort of self-determine, and that sort of rules out any other rights. And that's obviously a fantasy. That's obviously not the way things work. So, posting on X, Stella O'Malley said that the ICCL has no hold over school policies in Ireland. She was criticizing the Irish Times coverage of the new guide, which she said didn't bother pointing this fact out, that the ICCL has no hold over school policies in Ireland. And she contended that if teachers followed the guide, they'd be legally vulnerable. That's the quote. And that schools who follow it would harm vulnerable kids. You had pushback from the Countess, the women's rights organization, which said that their legal analysis refuted the ICCL's claims. They said the new guidance from ICCL is simply an activist wish list with no legal standing, which I obviously think is correct. More comments coming through constantly here. Paul on X saying, a doctor who biologically can't identify a human by their sex should not be a doctor, full stop. I think there's probably a lot to that, and a lot of people who would agree with you. Dermot saying, most of the transgenderism, I think, is fueled by epidemic levels of narcissism. I mean, obviously there's some degree of that in such a widespread social phenomenon. I'm sure that there's a lot of people who, this is just the thing. Young people are impressionable, and if this is the way to sort of gain social currency for a particular generation, a lot of people are going to buy into it, despite there being sort of little to nothing underlying it. I think for some people, it's a much more deeply rooted issue that has to be dealt with compassion. I mean, it should always be dealt with compassion, I suppose. But I do think, obviously, for some people, it is a way to sort of gain social currency, to gain a foot up the oppression hierarchy, as has become desirable. But back to it, the spokeswoman Leisha De Bruyne, spokeswoman for the Countess, said that quote, we are calling on government to make the law clear, and in the meantime, we urge all legal entities, schools, service providers, shops, and sport clubs to be aware that the ICCL guidance is not legally binding and may in fact be dangerous for service providers insofar as it is inaccurate, misleading, and not legally sound. Campaigner Jana London, founder of the Natural Women's Council, pointed to the ICCL's funding sources, which I obviously did, and described the organization as quote, simply a lobby group, another NGO with a direct line to government that bypasses democracy. So there's a lot of anger out there, and you'll notice I didn't quote a single man there. People of my identity, unfortunately, are precluded from joining in these conversations. Obviously, a perspective that I disregard by virtue of having a live stream and being with Gript. But yeah, a lot of women sort of on the front lines of this issue, which is also a curious phenomenon in and of itself. Well, it is curious and it isn't curious. I mean, it's also the case that this is an issue that disproportionately affects women. You very rarely have women who, identify as men trying to enter male bathrooms, whereas this is obviously something you see taking place in the opposite direction. Men who identify as women trying to gain access to sort of female changing rooms and female bathrooms. If we do have any sort of gender ideologues among us, they'll be horrified at my bogeymaning here. But anyway, we'll plow ahead. And obviously, it's not bogeymaning; it is something that happens and is deeply concerning. And therefore, it's no wonder, I suppose, that women would take such an issue with this, and indeed men should take an issue with it as well. Also, I find it endlessly funny. This is just my own observation, that J.K. Rowling has become such a champion on this contentious issue, and that it's made her so sort of maligned in British politics and probably global politics. I'm sure she gets hate from all over the world. Given that she is very lefty and liberal on pretty much everything else I can think of, I find it very funny that she's attacked as some sort of right-wing lunatic over this, where she's as far from that as can be. So on to the next thing. Sarah Ryan, who many of you will be familiar with, obviously from X, but also from her podcast on Gript that she does with our editor, John McGurk, the week that really was. She had a fantastic article on all of these, by the way, as ever, articles on the Gript website that you can tune into. You can have a look at now, have a look after this, have a look whenever you like. But I really do think as well, not to toot our own horn, this issue and these articles are one of the reasons Gript exists. You're not going to get coverage from this angle of this issue, despite its screaming obviousness, from any other publication in Ireland. I always feel like I can say these things because I'm sort of the last in the door to Gript in terms of a most recently hired staff member. But um, yeah, I was reading these articles and I was sort of like thankful the platform exists because these are really worthwhile articles. As you'll see now when we get into it, as I say, Sarah Ryan's article, "The Legally Dubious NGO Trans Rights Guide," and Sarah is a great person to be writing about this, given that she's a barrister, so she really knows her stuff. She isn't coming at it from a purely feelings based place, as so many people unfortunately do. You got Marie Carey on X. "Objective truth is under attack. Inversion and subversion. Respectfully, do not subscribe to it." Yes, you shouldn't subscribe to things that seek to attack, invert, or subvert truth. Um, I agree entirely, and I'm sure many people listening agree with that as well. So, to Sarah's article, she begins it with the seemingly obvious observation that clearly escaped the people in the organizations behind the guide, which is that we live in an era where legal rights claims collide daily. One person's right to one thing may trample on someone else's right to something else. Thankfully, though, as she points out, we have a functioning court system to adjudicate on these conflicts, which is where she gets into the guide. And she makes the observation, obviously rightly, that the guide conflates activist aspirations with enforceable law, presents non binding recommendations as obligations, and glosses over conflicts with other rights, especially those of women and girls, as we were just discussing. She had a great line in there about it risks confusing vulnerable people, attempts to bully schools and institutions, and ignores the consequences for anyone beyond trans youth. It seems the ICCL, TENI, and Shout Out are as willing to mislead trans youth about the law as they are about their biology, which I thought was a great line. This is where, yeah, it gets into the school stuff and this stuff. Like, I would say that like it's laughable, except that it really isn't, and it isn't going away. And if anything, it's sort of just become entrenched during a brief period of pushback, such as we've been experiencing lately. As Sarah writes, but we'll be getting into this more broadly, the guide states schools, quote, "must use preferred names and pronouns in all interactions and records," suggesting refusal is discrimination under the Equal Status Act 2018. It vaguely claims the gender ground typically covers trans and non binary people, and suggests complaints to the Workplace Relations Commission could succeed. No such case, has succeeded yet. And while a case could be taken, implying likely success lacks evidence and is simply not the settled law they say that it is. I'll zoom in on the school stuff a moment because I think this is again one of those areas that this issue just sort of is the straw that breaks the camel's back, because obviously you're talking about children here. You're talking about the most, good lord, it's taking me a age to scroll down through the document. I know exactly where it is. It is page 125. What a job I have where I know what page these documents things are. Slap Happy commenting, "We'll need after school classes to undo the damage." I mean, it wouldn't hurt. I think that's why Ben and I named the podcast The Long Game. I do think that sort of cultural renewal is an extraordinarily long-term project that needs to be undergone, and obviously such things as after school classes and extracurricular activity are part of the solution to that. Let me see here. All my bloody tabs open. Lose track of things. So, page 125 of the guide asks the question, "Do I have a right to have my correct name and pronoun used in school?" Which again is the part that the Irish Times article homed in on. Their answer: "According to Department of Education guidelines, your school must make every effort to update your name and pronoun in relevant systems and documents. It must also use your correct name and pronoun in day-to-day interactions." Note that word "must" there. because it doesn't have to do that. But anyway, it must also use your correct name and pronoun in day-to-day interactions. You should clarify with the school what your preferences are for name and pronoun usage in written communications to your parents or guardians. Um, like, yeah, what do you even say about that? It's something. I don't know. It is a topic that I kind of get lost for words on because it seems so obvious to me, but clearly not obvious to everyone, and certainly not to people in very influential positions in Ireland. Um, a little further on in her article, Sarah said that the guide conveniently omits the Constitution, which does. Article 40 6.1, which guarantees freedom of expression, protecting against compelled speech. No school or teacher can be mandated to use specific pronouns. That would breach staff rights, which is again one of those conflicting areas. No school or teacher can be mandated to use specific pronouns. These are Sarah's words here in the article. Misgendering is flagged as harassment, but the word appears in no Irish law, and free speech protections will safeguard against compelled speech in non discriminatory settings. The guide interprets gender protections as covering gender identity, but this again remains unadjudicated in Irish courts, and schools could very reasonably legally argue otherwise. Because we're focusing on schools, we'll skip on to an article that I put up today, not to toot my own horn, but I think it might be of interest. Because obviously, one of the aspects that was getting the most attention because of that Irish Times article, because of Sarah's article, was the guidance concerning schools. Again, you feel I could use air quotes 100 million times in this episode. Guidance. Um, I thought it was obvious. It was an obvious suggestion to put the questions to the department. So I sent them a couple of queries in relation to this. I asked first and foremost if the department could confirm that that is indeed the case, that schools must make every effort to update students' names and pronouns in systems and documents, as well as whether they're required to use preferred name and pronoun. I also asked the department whether schools that take an affirmative approach, i.e., ones that use students' preferred names and pronouns as opposed to their registered names and pronouns, um, have a requirement to notify the child's parents, guardian that that's the case. So I should preface this by saying the department is ever, not as ever. Sometimes departments, I want to be reasonable here. Sometimes department press offices can be very helpful. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they take a long time to get back to you. Sometimes they obfuscate. Sometimes, which is kind of the case here. Well, not kind of the case. It was the case. I would say somewhat. And they kind of danced around my queries, despite the fact that I put them in very sort of blunt. I put it very bluntly, and it was essentially a yes or no question, as is so often the case. They danced around and they sent me quite a spiel. They began by saying that, that schools are quote, required to create safe and inclusive environments for students, as outlined in the Beacon Alta procedures, where they experience a sense of belonging and feel safe, connected, and supported. So the Beacon Alta procedures, I wrote an article about this last year, if you're interested in that, are centered on, quote, child rights based approach, which I think is very important. I have I'm not sure if it'll be controversial amongst our listeners, but certainly controversial among modern society at large, probably, that children's rights is something of a dubious area. I sort of see it being used as a wedge that enables states to come in between parents and children. I would much more subscribe. Obviously, there are instances where parents are not particularly good guardians of their children, and sometimes the state is required to intervene. I don't deny that for a second. But I think increasingly often you see this across Europe. I mean, there are organizations that do wonderful work defending parents against states that overreach and that sort of step into interfamily issues that they really ought not to. Organizations like ADF International, as I say, doing very good work. I do think that sort of the children's rights field is being used as a bit of a wedge to come between parents and children in an increasing number of situations, not just in Ireland, but sort of across the continent and probably across the world as well. Although I'm less familiar with that. So the Beacon Alter procedures, as I say, are centered on that child rights based approach, and they are sort of being implemented in schools from the beginning of this academic year, so the current 2025-2026 school year. But it seems the main resource guiding the department's view of this topic is the 2016 document published for secondary schools, Being LGBT in School, which once again published by the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, which, if I'm remembering correctly, I'm off the top of my head, I think they collaborated previously with the that aforementioned organization, Chuck Feeney's Atlantic Philanthropies, on the 2015 marriage referendum. I think they collaborated on that, and so that's obviously a sort of instance, I suppose, of an organization like this having massive social implications, or massive sort of ability to shift the culture, I suppose. I've got a lot of comments coming in. My apologies, I've been neglecting them somewhat. Zero justice. Surely not all teachers are on board with this. The admin alone to follow with all the requests is massive. I actually don't think there's as many requests as you might think. I obviously don't have data for that, but I'm inclined to think that it's not as torrential as you might be inclined to think. But yeah, no doubt, surely not all teachers are on board with this. I mean, I know a number of teachers personally who wouldn't be on board with this, and indeed not only wouldn't be on board with this, are horrified by it and don't think it's good for the kids. So it's very much a kind of top down, well, yeah, top down thing that I suppose a lot of the organizations pushing it are also receiving support and or funding from the government, or have previously. So anyway, this Being LGBT in School, this guide that was published by the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network with the support of the then Department for Education and Skills, was leaned on very heavily by the department throughout their response to me. They said it provides assistance to schools in designing their policies that touch on issues, obviously relating to gender identity and sexuality. So the spokesperson for the department said it provides guidance to support key individuals as they fulfill their responsibilities in ensuring that their school is safe, supportive, and affirming of all students, which I think was a very interesting addition there. Affirming, because obviously we're well familiar with the phrase at this stage, gender affirming care, which is the view ultimately that the person who comes forward, the young man who comes forward, or the young woman who comes forward and says, I'm the opposite sex, the idea that the best thing you can do for them is support them in that transition, so to speak, affirm them in their belief that they are the opposite sex. Again, this wasn't outlined explicitly in the email, but I just think the use of the word "and affirming" of all students was very interesting, and I think uh, as a human being, I can kind of try and read between the lines there. Explaining the department's approach to the use of preferred names and pronouns, the spokesperson cited that resource, saying that there's nothing to preclude a school from using a student's preferred name in day-to-day interactions, regardless of the name used officially on the school register. Which, you'll note, that's a far cry from what the new guide was saying, which is that schools must use preferred names and pronouns. They say there is nothing to preclude. There's nothing, mandatorily stopping a school from doing that. They said all decisions should be taken with the welfare of the student as the primary consideration, and where possible, in consultation with the parents, guardians of the student. So you'll see why I said they were being tangential initially in their response, because they were very sort of non-committal. They, as I say, they said nothing to preclude a school from doing this. All decisions should be taken with the welfare. They say all decisions should be taken. They won't tell you which decision should be taken, despite the fact that's what I asked. But the way they phrase things, it seems to me, this is my interpretation, give away the sort of perspective that this is coming from. Decisions should be taken with the welfare of the student as the primary consideration. Obviously, we should be concerned about the welfare of the student, but I would say there are multiple competing considerations that come into play here. Indeed, the wishes of the parents and guardians. And I also thought, whether I'm just paranoid or not, that it was very interesting that they said, where possible, in consultation with the parents, guardians of the student. I mean, I acknowledge that there might be situations where for some reason or other parents or guardians, a child in an unorthodox circumstance or an unorthodox situation might not have those, whatever their sort of legal status might be. But I can't think of many circumstances in which it wouldn't be possible or it shouldn't be possible to bring the parents and guardians in on this. It seems very obvious. I mean, as a parent of two children who are b- too young yet to be going to school, they're 2 and 0. So a couple of years before I have to worry about any of this, I would much prefer if the Department for Education came back to me and said, yes, in all instances, parents are going to be consulted on this before the school takes any sort of action. But anyway, as I say, they were kind of tangential about this, and a lot of this I kind of had to infer. I leave it up to you listeners to decide whether or not um, you sort of accept the department's sort of framing of this or understanding of this, or whether you sort of think that it's a bit questionable. As I wrote in an article about it earlier, the department's child rights based affirmative approach that takes the student's welfare as its primary consideration indicates to me the parents' preferences for their children are secondary to the child's preferences. An interpretation, I suppose, is obviously that seems supported by the phrasing that parents, guardians should be consulted where possible. Um, and as well as that, towards the end of their correspondence, towards the end of the email they sent to me, the spokesperson referred back to that 2016 document, Being LGBT in School, and quoted 3 different segments that guide its thinking. And I'll quote those to you. They said that it's good practice to take time with the student and her parents, guardians to find the right solutions for their particular context. Obviously, I think that that's true, as long as the parents and guardians are being consulted. If the student is in some sort of extreme distress or is sort of, if it's an issue that's constantly coming up, it is obviously something that needs to be discussed. They quoted another segment from another page where they said, in general, it is extremely important to ensure that the correct gender, name, and pronoun are used to address transgender or intersex people, which is obviously stronger language, but again, it's a far cry from the ICCL guide that says these preferred names and pronouns must be used in school. And yeah, they quoted again that part I said where they said that nothing preclude a school from using a student's preferred name in day-to-day interactions, etc., etc. So that was the department's response. As I say, it was fairly non-committal and sort of circumspect. But attempting to read between the lines, it seemed to me that it was coming from a place that kind of, you know, it's nice if you're willing to do this, but there are obviously no obligations on schools to do so. Um, I see Anne Finnegan on Facebook commenting. Nice to have you with us, Anne. Children do not go to school to deal with adult issues. Under the Child First Act, no adult has a right to impose adult issues or material onto children. Children are not therapists for adult issues. This outright child abuse, which again I think is a view that probably is shared by a lot of our listeners. I do try to take perhaps naively the most charitable possible approach, which is that there's a lot of, obviously there are people across the world with sort of nefarious intent, but I do think a lot of this is just pure confusion. I think a lot of people have lost sight of what the human person is, and in my opinion, is for. And therefore, when you lose sight of that, it's very easy to sort of be led down the garden path and start sort of saying all things about what you can and can't do with your body and about what what is a good life ultimately. So I think that, as I say, it's obvious why this guide from the Irish Civil, get all my bloody organizations mixed up, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, as well as Tenai and Shout Out, which have previously provoked controversy, and you can read about that on Gript as well. It's obvious that they were going to get pushback on this. The guide sort of plugs all of these rights as being very obvious, despite the fact that they're anything but. And it's obviously given away by the fact that the sort of disclaimer at the bottom of every page says it's for your information only and isn't intended to substitute for legal advice, which you could, for a vulnerable young person who reads this guide, they could be forgiven for thinking that it was a solid legal basis for sort of, going to their school and telling them that their school has to use these pronouns they want to use now. But the last thing I wanted to have a look at, it's not something we reported on, it was a story in the Journal today, because it's indicative, I suppose, of the fact that while this is very prevalent in the Irish NGO sector, and indeed in sort of it seems to have a favorable reception in too many government departments and civil service offices. It's not a settled issue, and I don't think it will be a settled issue. There was a very interesting story in the journal today, um, emerging from that child law project report. I think that was where it came from of recent days. The journal reported an Irish judge insisted that a transgender child in care, obviously I would dispute that phraseology, transgender child. I don't think that's the case, be called by their original name. That was a quote. And remarks were made about a child being, quote, a biological girl in, quote, reality during reviews of aftercare plans in a Dublin district court last year. Um, in another case, a judge corrected a Tusla solicitor who was referring to a child by their preferred pronouns and told them that it was a, quote, biological reality that the child was, quote, a biological girl. So obviously you have judges who don't subscribe to gender ideology, but naturally the journal went to belong to for a quote, who were one of the organizations behind the guide, belonged to no, actually they weren't. That's my mistake. It's Tenai and Shout Out, so I obviously rescind that. But belonged to another one of those very influential organizations working in the same sphere, that does a lot of work in schools, actually. They told the journal that these comments raise concern about the potential for, quote, personal bias making its way into courtrooms that determine the care of children for whom the state is responsible. They said that the reports from the Children's Law Project are, quote, deeply concerning. Um, oh, God forbid personal bias should make its way into courtrooms when, that's essentially what you're dealing with when you have gender ideology in courtrooms. As though sort of adopting the view that people can be something other than the sex they were born as isn't a personal bias or isn't a non-neutral perspective. And this is something obviously that really has to go away, and it'll go away when people start, stop caring, essentially, that they might receive a little bit of pushback on this in polite society. The idea that the only neutral perspective is the secular, progressive, liberal perspective. Obviously, the secular, progressive, liberal perspective is itself a perspective, and therefore stands alongside any other perspective a person might have, be that religious, be that non-religious, conservative, be that libertarian, be that whatever it might be. So this fiction, I suppose, that yeah, the only people who are bringing bias into situations are, again, any of those people, conservatives, the religious. I mean, just saw my own camera there. It occurs to me this live stream is obviously a belong to 10i shout out ICCL workers' worst nightmare, uh, openly religious Gript journalist, harping on about the non-neutrality of the gender ideology position. But anyway, got end of the line. Joel, who is curious enough, we started with his comment and we'll probably come to the end with it, who said it does not matter whether transgenderism has a legal backing or not. Reality is reality, and sometimes the law is an ass. Um, yeah, something to that, all right. Fox Trot Oscar saying House of Cards starting to fall. They realize you can't force people to lie. I mean, this is ultimately it. As long as people refuse to sort of be socially coerced or socially pressured, I suppose, more accurate, into going along what they know to be untrue, what they know to be fantastical, this won't go any further. But that obviously does require being brave in social situations. And certainly, I know that those situations are family situations, they're situations with friends. And that's never an easy thing. But the truth is obviously worth aligning yourself with. Brendan O'Shea on Facebook saying, does anyone take the welfare of the rest of the children into consideration? Is it all about the confused child with delusional parents? Certainly at some level it seems to be, but thank God, as Sarah Ryan outlined in her article, the way the legal system works and the courts work is that there are competing legal claims, and there's obviously a lot more to child welfare than sort of the area of gender and sexuality. And those areas very much are roadblocks, you would say, to this moving further faster. So that is all we had time for this evening. I'm always talking about wanting to keep these shorter, and then we end up talking about a particularly fiery topic, and we end up at nearly an hour long. But an interesting one, I hope you'll agree, and an important one, because Ben and I debated on the podcast a couple of weeks back whether you'll know what I mean by this. Peak woke has passed. He was making the argument at the time that he thinks it has, whereas I was saying that I don't think it has. And I would say that guides like this are evidence of the fact that in Ireland, anyway, it certainly hasn't passed. I think if it goes to ground, it'll be because of international pressures or an uncertain international climate. But I'm not even sure about that. I mean, we're living in very uncertain times in which obviously America is providing something of a pushback against a lot of this, but it hasn't stopped people in Ireland from saying essentially crazy things on these topics. So I think it's more so the case that this stuff is just sort of biding its time until its day comes again. So more important than ever to be informed about it and to be ready to push back on it if needs be. As I say, all of the articles I was discussing today, with the exception of the last one that I mentioned, is from the Journal, but all of the other articles about the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties funding, all of the articles in relation to that guide that we were discussing this evening can be found on gript.ie. So feel free to hop on there after this and have a read if you like, and obviously to share them with people if you find them interesting. And we'll leave it there for this week. So thank you all for joining me across all of the platforms. And honestly, if you have any feedback in relation to this, I do get emails in, and I'm very appreciative of those. If you'd like to bring something to my attention directly, I read all my emails at jason@gript.ie. So any feedback after this, anything you'd like me to touch on or cover, feel free to get in touch with that email. But without further ado, I think we will leave it there for the evening. God bless you all, and we'll talk to you again next Wednesday.